My 16-year-old daughter uncovered our neighbor's dark past. The front door slammed so hard the picture frame on the hallway table rattled. Mia came barreling in with mud spattered on her sneakers, hair a mess, phone clutched in one hand like a lifeline. She stood in the doorway, chest heaving, and said 3 words that made my stomach drop. You need to see. If you live on a block where everyone smiles and waves, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments, did your neighborhood ever hide a secret like this? Because I'm telling you now, right from my kitchen floor, the calm neighborhood we thought was safe was lying to us. Mr. Ellis lived next door like he'd stepped out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Immaculate garage, hand-delivered casseroles when someone was sick, a plate of Halloween cookies that disappeared faster than you could say trick or treat. He mowed at the same time every Saturday, kept his hedge clipped to military precision, and had a smile so practiced most of us stopped wondering what was behind it. I was a parent first, protective, practical, used to smoothing over scraped knees and bad test days. But that afternoon, watching Mia holding a mud-soaked box like it was evidence of something dangerous, I felt the ordinary peel away from the world I'd known. Mia didn't wait for me to ask. She dropped the box on the kitchen table with a thud that echoed through the house. The cardboard was damp where she'd sat it on the porch, and when I peeled back the tape, that first smell hit me. Mildew and old paper, the smell of things that have been hidden for a long time. Inside were Polaroids, loose and curled at the edges, brittle newspaper clippings yellowed with age, a battered spiral notebook with pages filled in a cramped, impatient hand. On top, someone had scrawled a list of names and dates. At first, I thought it was the inventory of a collector, the way people collect old town ephemera. Then Mia pointed to one clipping, and the blood drained from my face. Mom, she said quietly, this is about the Henderson girl. She disappeared in '92. They never found her. I stared at the photo in the clipping, a smiling teenager at a summer fair. The date matched the list. My head buzzed with the impossible options. Neighborly eccentric, morbid archivist, or something far worse. Protective instinct warred with disbelief. Part of me wanted to march next door and demand answers. Another part, darker and more practical, wanted to document everything, to keep Mia safe while we figured out what we were holding. I slid a hand over the Polaroids. On the back of one, in faded ink, someone had written a name I'd never heard before. I pulled my phone out before rational thought kicked in, snapping photos, opening browser tabs, trying to find any mention of the names Mia had circled. The internet returned the old stories. A missing teen, a cold case with a wilted reward poster, a community that slowly stopped asking questions. The dates lined up. The handwriting on the box matched a note in the clipping. Each tiny match tightened the knot in my stomach. Mia sat on the counter, knees swinging, eyes fierce and a little too proud. I thought it was creepy, she said. But I went in the shed because I wanted to help with the project. I didn't think... Her voice broke, and I felt my role as a parent pivot from comforter to protector. We made a choice in that kitchen. Not to accuse without proof, not to involve strangers until we knew more, and not to let our curiosity endanger Mia. Instead, we would document everything, quietly and carefully. I would watch with a parent's wariness while my 16-year-old became the kind of detective every parent hopes they'll never need to raise. What we didn't know was how much of our neighborhood's past Mr. Ellis had packed into that shed, and how his ordinary smile would begin to crack under the weight of being discovered. The shed box felt heavier than its size suggested, like the weight of whatever people think they can tuck away and forget. I sat at the kitchen table, circling my thumb around the Polaroid edges while Mia rattled off what she'd seen. A tarp thrown over boxes, a loose window pane she'd nudged, the smell of old cardboard when she'd lifted the lid. Her words came fast, breathless with the kind of adrenaline I recognized from her first solo bike ride, or the time she stayed up all night to finish a science fair model. The Polaroids were a mix of ordinary and jarring. Picnics from decades ago, a fairground Ferris wheel, a blurred patch that might have been a license plate. The clippings were worse. Yellowed newspaper columns about disappearances and frantic reward notices, the ink smudged where rain had once fallen. The spiral notebook had marginalia, names, dates, and shorthand notes. Locations abbreviated, initials circled. On the underside of one photo, someone had scribbled a date in the late summer of 1992. At first, I did what parents do. I tried to normalize it. Maybe Mr. Ellis is a historian, I said, forcing lightness into my voice. Maybe he collects local ephemera, old man hobbies. Mia gave me that look teenagers give when your attempt at soothing sounds like a dodged question. She was already halfway to her room with her laptop, fingers flying. I felt conflicted, relief at a benign explanation, but a nagging hollow that wouldn't go away. The boxes didn't feel like collectibles. They smelled of damp secrecy. The handwriting on the notebook matched none of the tidy, civic-minded notes Mr. Ellis had ever left on our communal HOA board. Something about the cramped, hurried script told me this had been written by someone meticulous, but not necessarily harmless. Do I keep going? Should I call someone? I kept the questions folded tight for the moment and told Mia to photograph everything. Documentation, I decided, felt smarter than confrontation. Mia worked fast. Within an hour, she'd digitized everything. Photos, clippings, pages from the notebook. She cross-referenced names and dates while I made coffee I couldn't taste. The search results were small at first. An archived forum thread from 2003, a scanned police blotter from 92 with a terse entry. Henderson, L, missing, last seen at County Fair. Then a user-submitted memorial post with a faded photo that matched the Polaroid in front of me. Each match tightened the knot in my throat. I kept thinking of the normal things. Casseroles, the neighborly waves, how Mr. Ellis had once helped carry our groceries when my knee was injured. Those memories felt like props in a play I'd been watching for years without understanding the script. I texted my sister Claire, no answer, and then called Mrs. Ramirez from 3 doors down, the woman who'd lived on the block since before we'd moved in. "You remember a Henderson girl?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, sure," she said after a pause. "Sad business. Everyone whispered about it. Kids stopped going to the fair after that summer. But you know how small towns forget. People don't like to dig up old pain." "Did anyone suspect someone nearby?" I asked. She hesitated. People suspected who they suspected, but without proof, it was just gossip. That answer felt both comforting and infuriating. It meant the clues were old, muddled, exactly the kind of thing police shelve when leads dry up. It also meant there might be a trail, if only we cared enough to follow it. I made a choice then, quiet and urgent. We would not let this be gossip. Mia and I would document everything meticulously, see what patterns we could prove before we did anything public. If there was a name to connect to a face, we'd find it. If there were witnesses left alive, we'd talk to them. We worked until dusk. Mia logged everything into a secure folder on my laptop. Scans, high-res photos, transcriptions of the handwritten notes. I uploaded a backup to an encrypted cloud drive and put the originals in a sealed envelope hidden at the back of our closet. A parent's paranoia is practical. Preserve the evidence, limit exposure, and never let your kid take unnecessary risks. Mia insisted she'd just peeked in the shed. She hadn't meant to pry. But the way she spoke, methodical, careful, already thinking several moves ahead, reminded me of every time I'd worried she was too young for certain truths, and then watched her prove me wrong. She wanted to keep going. She wanted names checked, addresses pulled, timelines reconstructed. "We can do this quietly," she said, voice low. "I can ask Mr. Ellis about the shed under the guise of returning something I borrowed for the project. If he acts weird, we back off. If he gets defensive, we stop and call someone." I admired her bravery and hated that she needed it. My training, years of managing crises at work and parenting through scraped knees and heartbreak, felt both absurdly useful and utterly inadequate. I drew a boundary I hoped would protect her. No going into the yard alone ever again. If we needed to return, we'd go together during daylight with another adult present, or with a plan to call the police if things went sideways. Before bed that night, I texted our neighbor Mrs. Ramirez a vague message about finding old town ephemera, and asked if she remembered anything about summer fairs in the early 90s. Small community-level probing felt safer than dialing 911 on a hunch. As I lay awake, the neighborhood outside hummed its usual oblivious lullaby. Kids' bikes, the distant bark of a dog, the whisper of sprinklers. Inside, a sealed envelope waited in the closet, and a 16-year-old had just handed me a keyhole into the past. We were no longer spectators to our block's neat tableau. We were caretakers of a question that demanded answers. We agreed on rules. No rash moves, document everything, and if anything felt unsafe, walk away. Mia wanted to keep digging. I wanted to keep her safe. We compromised by structuring the investigation like a project. Roles, timelines, sources. She was the field researcher. I was the handler. "Would you go to the police right away or keep digging?" I asked on camera later when I told this story. Pause the video and tell me in the comments, because we needed to choose, and fast. First step, local records. We knocked on doors quietly. Mrs. Ramirez remembered the Henderson girl, but not much else. An elderly man 2 blocks over, Mr. Connors, invited us in for tea, and with surprising solemnity, pulled out a brittle scrapbook of clippings from 1991-1993. His hands shook as he flipped pages. Nostalgia and regret folded into one motion. "People whispered about Ellis back then," he said almost apologetically. "Nothing proved, though. Folks don't go poking if there's no hard evidence. Bad for business, bad for nerves." Next, the library. The town archivist, a sharp-eyed woman named Jo, treated us like a pair of amateur detectives and loved it. She taught Mia how to use microfilm and helped us pull the old county fair programs. In a stack of programs from 1992, Mia found a photograph of that summer's Ferris wheel. Cornered in a crowd shot was a man with a familiar posture. We zoomed in on his jacket buttons and collar in the scanned image. It looked like the man in one of the Polaroids. We also trawled online. Old forum posts, archived local news, and an amateur genealogy blog where someone had transcribed obituaries and missing person notices. Patterns started to emerge, a cluster of disappearances in the late spring to late summer months, all in the surrounding county. Some names on the list matched the notebook. One of the clippings referenced a man seen near fairground dumpsters the night of the Henderson girls' disappearance. We were careful to keep the investigation off social media. Public posts, we knew, could alert the wrong person, or worse, inflame rumor without proof. So far, our approach was stealthy, methodical, and driven by a kind of parental rage that felt cold and efficient at once. Joe from the library made a call for us, a retired forensic photographer she still trusted, and he swung by that afternoon with a battered laptop and a microscope. "Polaroids are funny little time capsules," he said, setting up carefully on our kitchen table like he was preparing a sacred relic. Under magnification, a faint fingerprint ridge showed on the corner of one photo. The developer stamp on the back had a code that placed the print run at a 1-hour shop in a nearby town in June of 1992. That was the sort of specificity we needed to turn whispers into something traceable. We traced the VFW membership number scribbled in the notebook to a small roster, a name that matched an alias in one of the passports we'd photographed. A faded Polaroid's background showed a chain-link fence with a graffiti tag I recognized from a defunct textile mill 2 towns over. Old maps narrowed the likely picnic spots to 3 locations. One was only a 10-minute drive from Mr. Ellis's house. As the evidence stacked up, so did my unease. We began noticing things that felt like reactions rather than coincidences. A plain white van with no logo started circling the block in the late afternoons, always slowing just long enough for me to glimpse a profile in the driver's seat. Once, as Mia walked home from school with a friend, she said a man in a hat had stepped out from behind a hedge to adjust his sunglasses as she passed. Nothing overt, but deliberate. I caught Mr. Ellis watching from his kitchen window the day we returned with more photocopies. When our eyes met, he gave a small, practiced smile and pulled the shade down. We also received a subtle warning. Taped to our mailbox one morning, a business card for a legal firm with no handwriting, just the phrase, "Some things should stay buried." The card was old-fashioned, printed on thick stock, and smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. I kept it in my pocket like a hot coal. That night we tightened the rules. No more solo trips. If we needed to be near the shed again, we'd bring a neighbor, preferably Mrs. Ramirez, and call the police if anything looked off. We were no longer polite snoops. We were a parent and a kid who'd accidentally poked a hornet's nest and now had to decide whether to run or stand our ground. The mailbox card sat heavy in my hand the whole next morning. I finally dialed the non-emergency police line with a voice that tried to sound calm and ordinary. The dispatcher told me to come down to the precinct, bring whatever evidence I had. "We'll file a report," she said, and the procedural tone was oddly comforting. Detective Lyle met us in a small windowless interview room. He listened without interruption as I spread the photos and clippings on the table, as Mia, quieter than she had been all week, pointed to the matching faces and the developer stamp. When I finished, Lyle pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and frowned. "You've done thorough work," he said. "Most people wouldn't have the patience or the care to document fingerprints and developer codes." He ran a fingertip over the Polaroid, reverent and clinical at once. "We can open a cold case review, but understand, unless we can tie this to a prosecutable offense with corroboration, it's messy." "Will you check Mr. Ellis?" I asked, the words out before I could temper them with caution. Saying his name aloud felt like casting a spell. "We'll look into any aliases or files linked to your items," Lyle replied. "But whatever you do, don't confront him. Not yet. People with secrets can be dangerous when pressured." That warning landed like a slap. The relief of official attention came twinned with a new layer of fear. We had privatized our suspicion and handed it to professionals who might end up putting us at risk if the subject felt exposed. Lyle asked about the white van and the man adjusting his sunglasses. He took down license plate fragments Mia had memorized from the Polaroids and promised to run them. He also asked me to leave the originals with the department as evidence, which I did. Handing over the sealed envelope felt like relinquishing a piece of our household's privacy to the state. When we left the station, the neighborhood looked the same. Kids on scooters, Mrs. Ortiz's rose bushes in bloom. But my chest felt tight, as if the whole street had been turned slightly askew. Detective Lyle said they'd start by checking local archives and the van's sightings. For the first time since we opened that box, I felt the heavy, surreal tilt of the situation. This was no longer just our secret. It was now an official question someone else would answer. We went home and made a plan to keep Mia safe while the police did their part. No walking alone, change routines, let trusted neighbors know we're being careful. And we waited, which is its own kind of torture. Detective Lyle called 3 days later. He sounded more measured than worried, an odd combination that made my stomach tighten. "The developer stamp checks out," he said. "It came from a 1-hour lab in Belford. The owner remembers turning over old film in '92, and when shown a photo, he thinks someone matching Ellis's description brought a batch that summer. It's not a smoking gun, but it's a thread. It was enough to make this a trail rather than a rumor. Enough to make my neighbor, my quiet, casserole-bearing neighbor, feel suddenly, dangerously close to being exposed. That weekend, the atmosphere on the block changed in ways that were almost microscopic. A neighbor who'd always waved now crossed the street instead. A PTA mom who'd been friendly at school drop-off avoided eye contact. Not everyone avoided us. Mrs. Ramirez brought over a pie and stayed long enough to ask if we needed anything. But the thin web of polite civility that had bound us together began to fray. Mia handled it with the composure of someone older than 16. She refused to go to the mall the next afternoon, citing a stomachache, but her jaw tightened when she texted friends. At school, whispers started. Kids are cruel with gaps in public knowledge, and once someone muttered "cop case" loudly enough that Mia heard. She came home and shut herself in her room for an hour, then pulled out the notebook and added another column. Potential witnesses. We followed small leads. A woman at the church bake sale remembered a man who used to take photographs behind the fairground, always alone. A retired groundskeeper recalled finding a Polaroid near the recycling area in '92 and putting it in his toolbox. He still had it. When we compared that Polaroid, faded, edges frayed, with the ones from the shed, my throat closed. Same jacket, same lean to the shoulders, patterns turned from coincidence into a slowly tightening noose. And then, there were the subtle threats. The white van returned twice in the same week, idling at the corner while a man drank coffee and watched the sidewalk. A voicemail with heavy breathing and no words sat on my phone one morning. Someone had scratched the word "nosy" into a scrap of cardboard and wedged it under our mailbox lid. At that point, the investigation stopped being only about historic justice. It became about keeping my daughter safe. Detective Lyle called again, quieter than before. He'd run the developer code and fingerprint through some old databases, and asked a favor of a retired analyst who still had access to microfiche nobody else bothered with. "We have a possible lead tying your neighbor to that town in '92, he said. "Nothing conclusive yet, but it's enough to justify watching him for now." They put a plainclothes officer on our block for a week. The first day he sent me a photo. Mr. Ellis leaving the house at 2:13 a.m., hood up, carrying a cardboard box to a car. The footage was grainy, but the silhouette matched the man who'd smiled at block parties for 20 years. The officer followed. Mr. Ellis drove to a storage facility 20 miles away and came back 40 minutes later. Small stuff could be old hobby materials, Lyle told me. Or it could be destruction of evidence. We'll keep looking. That night, Mia sat on my bed and asked the question every parent dreads. What if we made this worse? What if he hurt someone because of us? "I won't let that happen," I said, though I felt less certain than I sounded. We changed our routines like people on high alert. New routes, different pickup times, always someone with Mia. I met with a neighborhood group and told only those I trusted. Most of them were supportive, but a couple of neighbors looked at me like I'd broken an unspoken rule about privacy. Then the escalation. A camera on our porch was smashed and left dangling, a rock lodged into the mailbox with a note, "Back off." The detective increased patrols, and Lyle arranged for a formal interview with Mr. Ellis. Only, he cautioned, he couldn't make arrests without probable cause. It was a constant balancing act. Gather enough to make police action possible, but not so much that we became targets. At the same time, more corroboration arrived. A retired groundskeeper handed over an old Polaroid he'd kept in a toolbox for 20 years. The composition matched one of the shed photos. A plate fragment found in a Polaroid matched a license plate partial from a tow yard log in '92 that listed a rental car used near the fairgrounds. The threads were knitting together into a pattern that couldn't be ignored. We were close enough now that the tension in the neighborhood began to feel like a held breath. Ready to break. 2 nights later, Detective Lyle called at midnight. "We've been watching Ellis's storage unit," he said. "We caught him on camera late last week moving boxes. We have probable cause to get a search warrant if you want us to proceed." My hands went cold. "Do it," I said, the word feeling both inevitable and impossible. We drove to the precinct, Mia in the back seat gripping my hand until her knuckles went white. Lyle warned us again. There was no guarantee of finding anything directly tied to the cold cases. But the risk of leaving whatever was in that unit unexamined felt greater than the risk of being wrong. At dawn, police executed the warrant. I watched from across the street with Mrs. Ramirez and 2 other neighbors, the morning light washing the block in an ordinary gold that felt obscene. Officers hauled boxes from the unit, filed boxes, plastic tubs, battered shoe boxes. They opened them on the curb. Inside were more Polaroids, clippings, and a spiral-bound notebook almost identical to the one Mia had found. There were maps with routes circled, ticket stubs, and a receipt from a motel in a town near the fairground, dated the summer of '92. An officer held up a faded sweatshirt. The stain on the cuff matched a discoloration visible in a Polaroid taken near the recycling area back in '92. Detective Lyle called me over. "This is enough to hold," he said carefully. "We're treating this as evidence in a cold case investigation. We need to interview Mr. Ellis." When they took him in for questioning, he sat in the interview room with that practiced smile gone. For the first time since this started, I saw the man behind the neighborly facade looking small and human. He answered some questions narrowly, insisted some items were innocuous memorabilia, and refused to explain certain entries in the notebook. Lyle read a passage aloud, an entry describing a night at the fair and a misplaced girl. and I felt nausea rise so sharp it blurred the room. Mr. Ellis requested a lawyer. The cameras outside our house increased, and a reporter called asking if we'd comment. My phone filled with messages, supportive, accusatory, opportunistic, and through it all, Mia sat on the floor of our living room with the original Polaroid spread around her like a muted battlefield. We had provable evidence now, but the cost was immediate. Our privacy, our sense of safety, and the fragile normalcy the neighborhood clung to. Detective Lyle looked at me before he left and said, "You did the right thing, but this will get messy." At that moment, the question wasn't whether Mr. Ellis had a dark past. It was whether justice could untangle a decades-old shadow without breaking everyone it touched. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, hit like and share. Have you ever found something that made you question your neighbors? Tell me in the comments. The morning they arrested Mr. Ellis felt like an ordinary Tuesday that had been waiting for permission to be extraordinary. Detective Lyle called before dawn and said the warrant had been signed and the team would move at 6 a.m. He asked that Mia stay at a friend's house and that I bring only myself and the originals I'd left with the department if he needed me to identify anything. I dropped Mia at her friend's like a parent performing a duty I didn't want to admit terrified of. She hugged me so tight my ribs ached. "Be careful," she whispered. An absurd request given I was the one supposed to be keeping her safe. But it was also the most adult thing she'd said in weeks. We waited across the street with Mrs. Ramirez and 2 other neighbors. The search team arrived in quiet, practiced waves. Unmarked cars, officers in plain clothes, a sergeant with a clipboard. They moved to Ellis's driveway like people who knew the choreography of these things. For a moment I watched my neighbor, the man who'd once brought us casseroles, step out of his front door in a robe as if the world was still obeying the rules we'd all learned to respect. They cuffed him in his yard. He didn't resist. He didn't beg. Didn't shout. He let the officers guide him into the back of a squad car, the practiced smile gone from his face. Up close he looked younger than his age, and fragility threaded through his limbs now where we had only seen steadiness before. Detective Lyle asked if I'd come down to the station to answer questions and to identify the items seized from the storage unit if necessary. The interview room smelled like coffee and recycled air. Mr. Ellis sat at the opposite table, hands folded, staring at the tabletop. He met my eyes only once, with an expression that was hard to read, neither apologetic nor aggressive, just small and private. "Why?" I demanded before the officers could cue any formalities. It came out raw and simple. He looked at me as if answering a personal riddle. "Why do people collect things?" he said finally. "Why did you keep photos of your family? Why did people frame memories?" He stopped, swallowed, and his face became a mask I couldn't parse. "I didn't hurt anyone. I took pictures. I kept things. I wanted to remember." Detective Lyle cleared his throat softly. "Mr. Ellis, you understand you're being questioned in connection to multiple cold cases. There are materials linking you to locations and times of interest. We need straight answers." He sighed. "Some of those photos are mine. I took them years ago. I was interested. I kept clippings because I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. It's not what you think." When Lyle read an entry from one of the notebooks, an account of a night at the county fair where a girl was described as misplaced, I watched Mr. Ellis's face blanch. He inhaled as if remembering a detail I could not reach. He refused to answer more without a lawyer. That refusal closed the conversation in procedural terms, but it didn't close anything else. To me, his denials and evasions were proof enough that something in those boxes belonged to him in a way he could not explain away. To the detectives, his refusal to speak meant they had to keep building their case with forensics, witness statements, and corroborative documents. Outside the station, the neighborhood buzzed in ways I hadn't expected. A local reporter sniffed for a quote. An editor called asking if we'd be willing to speak on camera. A man who had once smiled at my front porch now avoided my driveway entirely. Inside the house, the echo of our normal life was warped. The mailbox bore the faint stain where someone had left that warning card. The smashed porch camera still dangled like a mute accusation. Mia came home that night quieter than before. She hugged me and then sat on the floor with the original Polaroids spread before her like relics. "I didn't mean to start this," she said, voice small. "I only took a shortcut." "You did the right thing," I told her. It was the truth and simultaneously an attempt to anchor us both. You were brave. You were careful. You helped get answers. But bravery doesn't erase cost. Over the next days, Mr. Ellis's arrest brought a flood of consequences. The department issued a statement about an active cold case investigation, neighbors speculated in the grocery store, and Mia fielded whispers at school. The reality of our cul-de-sac's safety had been punctured, and there was blood in the hole. Legally, the situation was complicated. The evidence from the storage unit established probable cause for further charges, but cold cases take time. DNA results, witness re-interviews, and sometimes the slow, frustrating unspooling of unreliable memories. Prosecutors told me to prepare for a long legal process. They warned that denials and legal maneuvering could drag this out for months or years. Emotionally, the cost was immediate. I had to explain to neighbors, to my siblings, to my own parents why our house had become a locus of investigation. I had to reassure Mia without trivializing the fear she felt. I had to accept that our inviolable little world now had sharp edges. And yet, threaded through the fear and the fury, there was also a fierce, clarifying light. For the first time, voices that had been ignored were being heard. Names that had been lost to the margins were back on a table where someone could look at them seriously. That was a fragile, imperfect kind of justice, but it was movement in the right direction. The confrontation didn't tidy everything. It opened a legal mess and left people to reckon with broken trust. But it also forced a community to face a past it had carefully shelved. For Mia and for me, it meant living with consequences we hadn't chosen, but also living with truth. The months after the arrest felt like a slow tide, sometimes receding, sometimes surging, never quite settling. Detectives brought in forensic specialists, compared stains on a sweatshirt against profiles from archived evidence, with results that would be relied on in court, and re-interviewed witnesses who had once been too frightened to speak up. Some pieces fit, others stubbornly resisted pattern. There were small victories. The county reopened 2 cold cases officially. A local historical society digitized its fragile fairground records. A woman who had been a teenager in '92 came forward after seeing an article and said she remembered a car parked oddly that night, something she'd never told police before. The cumulative effect of small testimonies was to turn rumor into a prosecutable trail. There were painful setbacks, too. Some neighbors turned cruel. Emails accusing me of seeking attention. Whispers that we'd ruined the neighborhood's reputation. A few friends drifted away, uncomfortable with the moral complexity. The press cycle churned through angles, victim, vigilant parent, neighborhood scandal, and we were uncomfortable actors in every iteration. Mia carried the weight differently than I did. At first she was shut down, avoiding friends and school events. I enrolled her in counseling. She met with a therapist who specialized in adolescent trauma. Slowly, she learned language for the fear, the guilt, and the strange pride she felt. She channeled the experience into action, helping a cold case volunteer group compile digitized archives, speaking to her class about online safety, and eventually testifying about her findings if prosecutors called on her. Watching her transform that pain into agency brought a complicated pride. I was proud she'd acted. I was proud she'd handled the chaos with a maturity most adults lack. I was also furious at the world that forced her into it. Legally, the case moved forward. Charges were filed based on the accumulation of evidence: photographs, receipts, corroborating witness accounts, and a pattern of behavior that matched the timelines of old disappearances. Mr. Ellis pleaded not guilty. The courtroom became a new theater where evidence would be examined under a cold, impartial light. The trial, when it finally came, would be brutal in its clarity and heartbreaking in what it revealed about memory, accountability, and the ways ordinary lives can conceal terrible things. For the neighborhood, recovery was uneven. Some homeowners put up new security cameras and formed a neighborhood watch. Others moved away, the stain of publicity too heavy to bear. We planted flowers by the curb one spring and hosted a small potluck for neighbors who stayed, both as a gesture of reclaiming our street and as an offering to the children who still needed a place to play without fear. I found myself reflecting often about what it means to trust the ordinary. It's easier to live with a pleasant fiction than to test every smile for history, but trust without curiosity can become complicity. I don't mean to say people should live in suspicion. Rather, I learned to value awareness, small acts of noticing that, in aggregate, keep communities safer, remembering names, listening to elders' stories, paying attention to things that seem off. There was also a quieter morning, for the version of normal that had allowed Mr. Ellis to be a prop in our lives, for the simple pleasures that felt complicated now, a neighbor's casserole, a lawn mowed with care. We had to teach our children that the world is both beautiful and dangerous, and that courage sometimes looks like asking questions. Months later, standing at Mia's school awards night as she accepted recognition for her community work, I thought of the box in our closet and the decision we'd made on that kitchen floor. The choice to document, to be careful, to seek help rather than confront alone. It had been the slimmest of lines between harm and healing. We crossed it, imperfectly, but together. If this story moved you, if it reminded you to pay attention to the ordinary people around you, please subscribe and share your neighborhood stories in the comments. Have you ever found something that changed how you looked at your block? Tell me below. Let's keep looking out for each other.